Hello everyone, it's Seth, probably better known as Saffron Olive, and I'm super excited to have a special video for you today. So today I'm joined by Richard. How's it going today, Richard?
Hey Seth, what's going on?
Not much. I'm excited to talk some Ixalan. So we finally have the whole set, which means today Richard and I are going to be breaking down the best cards from Ixalan for the modern format. So we have a top 10 list, also have a few honorable mentions, so actually quite a few cards to talk about. But Richard, before we jump into the countdown, what's your overall impression of Ixalan in modern? Good set, bad set, kind of mediocre set? Where does it fall on that scale?
I would say medium. There aren't any obvious, crazy cards for Modern. There aren't going to be any new decks like when we got Eldrazi, but there's some solid cards which I think will slot in, and all of the cards require kind of design choices and decisions for your deck, so I like that. So I would say it's a medium set for Modern.
Yeah, I think I agree with you, although I will say I was very impressed with the quality of commons and uncommons. As I was making out this list, I was like, wow, a lot of the cards we're excited about are actually lower rarity, which is kind of nice, because then you're not going to have the price concerns of it's a chase mythic that's $30. A lot of the best cards from the set are probably going to be pretty accessible, so that's kind of I guess a nice upside to see a strong batch of commons and uncommons in the set. Anyway, let's jump into it with the honorable mentions. And first off, we kind of lumped all these cards together because they're worth talking about. Not sure exactly how good they'll be, but this is the enchantment that flip into land cycle. So first off, we have the green and blue members of the cycle, Growing Rights of Itlimoc in search for Azcanta. So Richard, any thoughts on either of these two cards in Modern?
Yeah, the most obvious thing is the green one looks kind of broken because on the flip side, it's a strictly better Gaia's Cradle. So Elves comes to mind as the immediate home for this. It's easy to get a bunch of Elves on the battlefield quick, and then you can tap the land to make a ton of mana to pump your Elf team with Azuri. So that's the only use I can think of this. I can't think of any fair way or any other way to do this, but going wide with Elves seems like a good plan. I suspect a lot of people will try this out to see if it's worth jumping through the hoops to get the Gaia's Cradle.
One thing I was impressed by with this entire cycle is the payoff is really strong on pretty much all of them. Gaia's Cradle is a broken Magic card. Staple all the way back to Legacy. Super, super good. But the big question is, do you have to do too much work to get there? And that's, I think, something we just don't know the answer to yet. But I know I will definitely be trying it. I'm also excited for Search for Azcanta, just because it seems like it's pretty easy to flip. We got fetch lands in the format. A lot of controlling decks have tons of cheap interaction. You're playing Thought Seizes, and you're playing maybe Thought Scours and Serum Visions and all that kind of stuff. So it's pretty easy to get cards in your graveyard. And then the back half of Azcanta, the Sunken Ruin, is kind of like this impulse that only hits non-creatures and non-lands, but that's still a lot of value if the game goes long in your control deck. Just have a land that you can tap and continually draw more cryptics, draw more removal, draw more card draw, whatever you need. So I think both of those cards have at least some shot. I think people will at least explore them in Modern. Whether or not they actually catch on, I think we gotta wait and see, but I think they're close enough that they're worth testing at least. Moving on to our other two flip cards, we have Legion's Landing, the white member of the cycle, flips around into a token maker. And Richard, I know you really love this one, the black member of the cycle. So what do you think about these two?
Alright, I'll go with the non-traditional choice of the black member of the cycle. There are decks in the format that reward you for having low life, such as Death Shadow. There are decks in the format where you try to get as greedy as possible, like, say, Jund, and you have Bob triggers and whatnot getting your life low. So you can draw cards with a greed-like effect, and when you're so low you're about to die, it turns into a land, you sacrifice your Tarmogoyf, gain life back, and hopefully by then you've buried your opponent in card advantage. So I'm actually really excited to try this out for mid-range mirrors and, control matches in black-green decks. So I think this is a sleeper. I think people are kind of underestimating it, but just drawing a card every turn is worth it. I would pay 2 life to do it. 2 mana, 2 life, maybe a lot, but it's repeatable, so I'm excited to try this out in my Jund deck.
As far as Legion's Landing, for me, I think that's mostly, if it does make it in Modern, it'll be like a one of and maybe a token deck. It's pretty easy to flip if you have Spectral Processions, Lingering Souls, cards like that that make 3 or 4 creatures with 1 card, then it's pretty easy to flip it around, and making a 1/1 doesn't sound like a lot, but it's kind of just free value. I've seen random decks in Modern playing Westville Abbey as like a one-of, Tokens can do it, Elves has occasionally done it, so maybe there's a chance that it shows up as a one-of in a really specific deck that can flip it around pretty easily. Well, let's move on to the rest of our honorable mentions before we get to the top 10. So we have 4 honorable mentions all lumped together here. Arcane Adaption, Perilous Voyage, Merfolk Branchwalker, and Shaper's Sanctuary. So Richard, any thoughts on any of our honorable mentions?
Perilous Voyage is an interesting option. We have plenty of bounce spells already. The most obvious one that's being used today is Echoing Truth, and you usually use it to remove hate cards from the battlefield before you storm off in Storm. For example, bouncing a ley line or something. Perilous Voyage lets you do that, and if the hate card is less than 2, you get to scry. So I don't know if that's good enough, because typically you don't start bouncing things until you're sure you're going to win. So you already know what you have. But maybe this bounces a Goyf, lets you scry 2, and then you get to combo off. Interesting choice. Echoing Truth does hit multiple of the same card, so that's the difference. So I don't know that it'll be strong enough, but it's worth testing to see if that scry is actually very relevant.
Yeah, I think that's basically where I would see it too. Maybe in a Storm deck, bounce a Rest in Peace or something, and then try to go off. Like you said, it's not clearly better than a Echoing Truth, or there's cheaper options. I think Void Snare, I think it is a 1-mana bounce anything option. But the Scry 2 can do some nice desperation mode type stuff if you're trying to dig to find your Grape Shot or your Gifts Ungiven or something. As far as the rest of the cards, I wanted to mention Arcane Adaption just because there's combo potential. I don't know if any of the... I think there's actually quite a few different combos. I don't know if any of the combos will be competitive, but it's worth knowing that it's way cheaper than Conspiracy, so if there is going to be a creature type switching combo, this will probably be the card that makes it happen. Branchwalker reminds me a little of Silvergill Adept as far as how it actually plays. The body is similar, the cost is similar, the drawing a card is similar, but I don't know if Merfolk will actually end up green. And then Richard, I think you added Shaper's Sanctuary to the list. What were you thinking about this one?
Yeah, it's very strong in any green deck versus any deck with spot removal, Jund, Grixis, those kind of decks. Anytime one of your creatures becomes target spell, you draw a card. So for decks like Coco, you have just lots of random creatures sitting around. Shaper Sanctuary lets you replenish your hand when they're removed. So, bolting the bird is not as appealing when they get to draw a card to replace that bird.
Yeah, it does offer a lot of good protection. You can see it in, mono green Stompy decks, any of the green creature decks you're talking about. I think it's pretty clearly sideboard only, but in certain matchups, it could definitely really shine. Like you were saying, against your Jund deck, where you're looking to bolt and Fatal Push and Kolaghan's Command everything. It's a lot of value that you'll get as your stuff is dying. So anyway, I think that brings us to the end of our honorable mentions, which means it's time to jump into the top 10 list. And coming in at number 10, we have Tocatli Honor Guard, a new human soldier, which is basically an old artifact on a stick. It's essentially Torpor Orb with a body. So, Richard, any thoughts about this one? I know Torpor Orb does occasionally see sideboard play. It's not as popular now as it has been. It was a sideboard staple at one point. Is being a creature an upside or a downside if you want a Torpor Orb effect?
I think it's a downside usually. There aren't too many decks right now where this is entirely relevant. Being a 1/3 is a lot worse than a 2/2 or a 3/1. So it's a hate bear, but it's a 1/3 hate bear, so it's like a defensive hate bear. So I don't know. It depends. It could stop certain combos and certain creatures, but I just don't like the 1/3 body. It's a bit weak when you're playing a hate bear type archetype.
Yeah, not having 2 power is a bit annoying. I know when I first saw it, I was like, oh, this is awesome. It's a Torpor Orb that you can Court of Calling for, you can Collected Company for, since it's a cheap creature. The problem is, the decks that are usually playing those cards are using Eternal Witness, using creature-based combos like the Anafenza, Kitchen Finks type combos, and you actually don't want to see a Torpor Orb. So while you can theoretically do that, most of the decks that are playing those cards don't want the effect of the Honor Guard. So I think we'll have to see. I think it's something that if we get back to the point where decks are playing Torpor Orbs in their sideboard to fight those kind of combos, then you could see Death and Taxes, decks like that. Like, it can slot into those decks. So if a Torpor Orb ability becomes relevant in fighting the format, I think it's a fine option to have available. But right now, I don't know. It'll probably sit on the sideboard, and it really depends on your build. You have to have a reason to want it to be a creature like Collected Company to want to play it over Torpor Orb, I think. Moving on to number 9 on our list, we stick with the White Hate Bears. KINJALLI'S, Sunwing, 3 mana, flying, make sure opponent's creatures enter the battlefield tab. So, Richard, do you think this is better than probably the most easy comparison, Thalia, Heretic, Cathar? They're kind of similar. You give up taxing your opponent's mana to get an evasive body instead of a ground body. What do you think?
Yeah, it's evasive. It's 2/3 versus a 3/2 for strike. It's not legendary, so you can play multiple. But three mana is a tough spot on the curve because there's just so many good options. I just can't imagine a 2/3 flying being enough. I think Thalia, with her downside of being legendary, is still way better. 2/3, I don't know. It needs to be at least 3/2 or something. It just doesn't have enough power to justify its cost.
Yeah, and there's not really any advantage to having 3 toughness. Lightning Bolt, Lightning Helix kills them all. Fatal Push with Revolt kills both of them. So it's not like standard where you're like, oh, this dodges Shock and Magma Spray, where you can actually argue that 3 toughness is a relevant upside. In Modern, it doesn't really work that way. And from playing against Thalia, I always forget about the non-basic land thing, and it does occasionally just get me like, oh, I'll do this and play my land and kill this, and I'm like, oh, the land enters tapped. I'm going to die now. And you don't get that benefit from KINJALLI'S Sunwing. So we'll have to see. I'm keeping my fingers crossed, and also slightly horrified that they're going to print like the Eldrazi Temple for dinosaurs in the next set.
then this card suddenly becomes very good.
Yeah, so we'll see. Maybe, it's a Modern Pro Tour. If you remember, Oath of the Gatewatch, Modern Pro Tour, Wizards maybe wanted to have Eldrazi show up in Modern, so maybe we'll see that happen with dinosaurs come the second Ixalan set this winter, so that might be the best hope for Sunwing. Let's move on to another 3-drop. I know you were just kind of trashing 3-drops in Modern, Richard. What about Rampaging Ferocidon? Does this one have more potential as a 3-drop in the format?
I like it. The players can't gain life is very, very relevant in Modern if you're playing an aggressive red deck. And it has Menace, meaning you need 2 creatures to block, which is actually very hard because unless you're playing a green, like a green elves deck, most decks just play like a single creature. They have like a single Tarmogoyf, a single Death Shadow, so they can't block unless they play a second creature. And whenever another creature enters the battlefield, Ferocidon deals 1 damage to them. So it's a very aggressive card, and I like it. 3 is expensive. I don't know that kind of burn decks or kind of Naya Zoo decks can afford to play too many of these, but it does have enough abilities that it makes it very annoying for your opponent to come back.
Yeah, it seems like a worst case, like a potential sideboard card for aggressive decks. Even if you don't start it with it in the main deck, I know if you're playing Burn or something, one of the things that beats you is life gain. Like, you really don't want to see life gain across the battlefield, and it's not that uncommon to see Blessed Alliances, to see Lightning Helixes, that Kitchen Finks, those kind of incidental life gains. It matches up incredibly well against Finks. Not only do you keep the life from being gained, but you double the ping trigger when it comes back in with Persist. So I think the floor for Ferocidon is potentially good sideboard material for Burn and other aggro decks. In the ceiling, depending on the meta, like if somehow Soul Sisters becomes much more popular with some of the reprints making it a more effective budget option with Iconic Masters coming up, and if that kind of creeps up in the format, then you'll definitely see aggro decks be even more interested in this effect. Like, you have ways to stop players from gaining life, but they don't come attached to a fairly efficiently costed 3/3 body. You're playing like Everlasting Torment, a 3-mana enchantment, the Leyline of Punishment, 4-mana enchantment, that can't actually deal damage on their own. They're just keeping your opponent from gaining life. So I think there's actually a lot of potential there as far as being a really strong sideboard card for burn decks and other aggro decks. Well, let's move on from the world of burn to the world of land destruction in Field of Ruin, kind of a new fixed, or at least weird, version of Ghost Quarter. What do you think about this one, Richard?
I think it's pretty fringe. So it's kind of like Ghost Quarter, except you need to pay 2 mana, and you also get a basic land, so you don't go down the land like you would with Ghost Quarter. The only time I think this is relevant is if you're playing a control deck, where, you know, you actually want land number 6, 7, 8, or whatever. Otherwise, I think the 2 mana activation is probably too much. The nice thing about Ghost Quarter is you can just leave the Ghost Quarter up, tap all your other mana, and then use it when you need to. The other card comparable to is Tech Edge, in which case your opponent needs more lands for you to activate it, but it costs 1 mana and they don't get a replacement land. So I don't know that many decks will pick this up. Maybe the odd control deck, but I think Ghost Quarter and Tech Edge are better in more general purpose cases.
I think you're right for general purpose cases, but I'm actually kind of high on this card for Leonin Arbiter, Death and Taxes decks in specific. So those decks, they're using Leonin Arbiter to kind of fizzle the search and turn your Ghost Quarters into Strip Mine, because your opponent has to pay 2 to be able to search their library. And those decks commonly play 4 Ghost Quarters and even up to 4 Tech Edges, because they're using Ether Vial to cheat their stuff into play. And I have to think in that deck, I would rather have Field of Ruin than Tech Edge, because you don't have to wait. And if your plan is to Ghost Quarter your opponent on turn 2 after Arbitering, the odds that your opponent's going to get enough lands on the battlefield for you to be able to Tech Edge, it actually gets kind of low. But Field of Ruin doesn't have that drawback, and since you have Vial, the 2-mana activation isn't as much of a drawback as it would be in other situations. Like, you can already kind of afford to do that. So that's where I think it might have a shot to be in a tier deck, would be as a replacement for Tech Edge is Ghost Quarters 5 through 8 in the Death and Taxes list, potentially. Well, let's move on to one of my favorite types of cards, the classic 1/1 flyer that has some sweet upside and can counter some stuff. This one is Siren Stormtamer. So, Richard, how does this compare to some of the great ones from the past? Judge's Familiar, Mausoleum Wanderer. Is this next in line in that blue Flying Men slot?
Probably, I don't know. You get to just straight up counter something. You need a blue mana to do it, and it has to hit you or creature you control. So in decks where you're interested in protecting something, maybe you're interested in protecting your Delver of Secrets, or maybe you're interested in protecting your Death Shadow or your Gurmag Angler, Tasigur, this is very annoying. It means they need to spend a removal spell to remove the Siren before they can remove your other creature, and that's just might be enough time for you to win the game. Now, it is a Siren Pirate Wizard, and it's a 1/1, so there's no obvious synergy. Obviously, if there was a Pirate deck or a Siren deck or a Wizard deck that could pump this, it becomes much, much stronger, kind of like Curse Catcher and Legacy. But just the protection itself, I think, is good enough. And 1/1 evasive flyer is okay. It trades with Lingering Soul tokens, but it can chip some damage in.
That's why you need favorable wins. That's the solution to the Lingering Souls problem. So I actually played for Budget Magic not that long ago. We played favorable wins, which was exactly built around these type of cards. 1/1 flyers for 1 blue mana. And I think that for me, this one probably ranks just behind the Mausoleum Wanderer and Judge's Familiar. I think that the countering is nice. The part that scares me is in a lot of decks, you want to be countering like Anger of the Gods or a Wrath of God type effect, and this actually doesn't do a very good job there, but it does do a really good job of fizzling targeted removal, and it still does get Conflagrate to your face, like helps in the combo matchup. So while I don't think I would play this over Mausoleum Wanderer or Judge's Familiar, I think it's definitely better than the next next best options, which are just kind of like 1/1 flyers with really fringe upside, like Fairy Miscreant draws you a card if you happen to have another one on the battlefield, which hardly ever happens. So I think it's third in line, but in really specific decks. Even the Grand Architect deck, which I think Zach Elsick originally built, is kind of built around these kind of effects. You can tap them to add mana with Grand Architect to cast big artifacts. So I think it could have fringe homes there, but I'm not sure it quite beats out Judge's Familiar and Mausoleum Wanderer. Well, let's move on to number 5 on our list, the new legendary Merfolk Coppola, Warden of Waves. So, Richard, there's one question for this one. Obviously a Merfolk card. The question is, does this beat out Kira if you're building Merfolk? Like, is it better in that role of protecting your stuff?
I'm going to say no, but it's up for debate. Kira just straight up counters your stuff, right? Kira makes you have to use 2 spells or abilities. Kira has flying. Kira, the downside is Kira's a spirit, doesn't get pumped by your lords. Coppola makes your opponent spend 2 more mana, but that's not as big of a deal as it sounds. Like, if they have a Path to Exile, it's a 3 mana Path to Exile now. So they can still force things through with just 1 card. Your upside is you have a Merfolk now, so this thing becomes 3/3, 4/4 with enough lords. I think Kira is better. I think the straight up ability to counter something and the fact that it flies, it lets you randomly block Lingering Souls, it lets you chip in damage where your Island Walk may not be relevant. So I think Kira still edges this out, but it's close, and I suspect people will try both to see how it plays out.
Yeah, I'm actually on your side of this debate, where I think that for the exact reasons you described, that Kira is still better, but I know there's definitely very good Magic players that disagree and think that Coppola could be better. The other question, I guess, is there any way you can squeeze this in as a one-of on top of Kira? I mean, multiple Kiras kind of lose a bit of value since they're legendary. You really don't want to draw 2. Is there a chance that you play 1 Kira and 1 Coppola in your Merfolk deck? Like, is that a thing that could happen?
Yeah, that might actually be what happens, because being Kira flooded is actually a weird and strange thing that happens. So having 1 Coppola and 1 Kira out is pretty good. So maybe people just end up splitting them. That is a very real possibility.
Well, let's move on from the world of Merfolk to the world of sorceries. Entrancing Melody, a new X sorcery that gains control of a creature with converted mana cost of X. So, Richard, what do you think of its modern potential?
I mean, we have just straight up control magic type cards, Threads of Disloyalty, Vildacan Shackles. I guess you can steal a Death Shadow for 3 mana, a Tarmogoyf for 4, and then you can Snapcaster and do it again. But traditionally, it requires you to be losing to make use of this. Like, you need to have a Goyf that you can't deal with to take. And I don't know. I don't really like control magic cards. They are backbreaking when they work. But we already have a lot of solid options, and they don't really see play today. So, getting Death Shadow is not too exciting when you have a high life total. It just instantly dies. You just basically spent 3 mana to kill a Death Shadow. So I don't know.
Yeah, I think there was a time when Threads of Disloyalty was a pretty heavily played sideboard card to steal Tarmogoyf. It was actually a real thing. We're not really there anymore, so I think the argument for Entrancing Melody is, if we get back to the place where Threads is a realistic option, then I think you might just want Entrancing Melody, because the Snapcaster synergy is a nice benefit, and as far as the actual effect, it is pretty comparable power level wise to Threads. Yes, it's 1 more mana if you want to steal the Tarmogoyf, but the upside of that is your Entrancing Melody doesn't get Abrupt Decayed or have some of those weird things that can go wrong with an enchantment go wrong, and then you get to Snapcaster it back. Obviously, I don't know. If you want to be stealing big things, there's better ways of going about it. Like, you never want to try to steal a Primeval Titan with this. It's just not going to happen. But I could imagine a specific metagame where this card could actually be a pretty reasonable one-of in the sideboard, maybe in the main deck for Snapcaster decks to fight against Tarmogoyfs and Death Shadows and stuff. But I don't think we're there right now.
Mono Blue Tron, taking Ulamog.
Oh, that actually is pretty sweet. Well, let's talk about another sweet uncommon land, Unclaimed Territory. Basically a very fixed, very budget-friendly version of Cavern of Souls. So, any thoughts on this one, Richard?
if you play 5-color tribal, you will put this in your deck. If not, you won't. So slivers, allies,
humans, yeah.
So those decks would just auto-include this card, and if you're not, maybe you can abuse it somehow. It does make colorless mana if you need colorless mana for some reason, and you can just name random creature types like wizard or human or something that might have incidental synergies, but I think this is mostly for your tribal decks.
Yeah, this is one of the cards that I'm most confident will see play in Modern, but it's going to be, like you said, in very specific decks that are right now kind of Tier 2, Tier 3, slivers, humans, allies. There might be another one that I'm not thinking of, but it's basically, if you're going to be 4 or 5 color tribal, this has got to be better than playing a City of Brass type card or something, where you're paying a life every time you add a mana. Like, I think it's a strict upgrade on a City of Brass, on whatever the Dragon's Mage's version of City of Brass was, Mana Confluence. So I think it's a strict upgrade there. So I feel very strongly this will see play in Modern, but I don't expect that you're going to see it all the time. It's going to be when you run into those weird, crazy decks, and it's going to be very good in those decks, though, as a free, no-life required 5-color land. Well, let's move on to our top 2. 2 more cards to go. Number 2 on our list, we have the new Pithing Needle, Sorcerous Spyglass. So, Richard, does the peak make this better than a Pithing Needle?
Depends how good you are at Magic, I guess. And I guess it depends on the other cards in your deck. I mean, if you have Thoughtseize, Inquisitions in your deck, the value of paying 1 more mana to see your opponent's hand goes down. If you're really good at Magic and you can name the exact card that you're going to lose to, you don't need the 1 mana. But I think for most people, I think this is a good fallback. If you don't have that free Thoughtseize to take a look and name the exact card, sometimes there are 2 cards that will kill you. You don't know which one to choose. Well, here you get to look at their hand and choose the one that's actually in their hand. So I think some people will use this. It depends on the deck. I don't think any black-based decks will use it. Gitaxian Probe decks, the card is banned now, but those decks wouldn't use it either because they have the free peak. But all other decks that don't have the free peak, I think it is worth paying 1 mana to take a look sometimes.
I mean, the information is definitely valuable. Like, knowing what's in your opponent's hand does increase your chances of winning. Like, it helps you play better. You can play around things and know exactly when your opponent might be trying to go off or do their thing. Although, when I first saw this card, I thought it was great for Standard, but I was like, I would never play this over Pithing Needle in Modern or in Legacy. But I've kind of come around to it for one really specific reason. I like decks that play Chalice of the Void. I also often have Pithing Needle in those decks, which is a pretty significant non-bow when you're countering your own Pithing Needles, when you put your Chalice on one. So I think this is almost always going to be a better Pithing Needle if you're playing a Chalice deck in Legacy or Modern, because the plan of those decks is almost always to get Chalice on one as quickly as possible. So this kind of gives those decks a way to still have a Pithing Needle, which is a pretty important effect, while not having that pretty significant non-bow of countering your own stuff. Well, let's move on to our last card. Another random common. This one people are pretty hyped about. We debated a bit on the podcast last week. This is Opt. So, Richard, are you in the Opt camp as far as it being the new broken cantrip in Modern? Are you going to get banned, all that stuff? Or is it just a worse version of Serum Visions and Sleight of Hand and the other options?
I'm on the camp that it's better. It's going to see play. I don't know that it's better than Serum Visions. I don't think it's broken. I think it's good enough that it'll see play in a bunch of decks, and if I have Serum Visions in my deck today, I would look to experiment with Opt. I like instant speed a lot in Modern, and getting the card immediately helps. Because sometimes you Serum Visions, you see the card you want, but you already drew your terrible card for the turn, and you need to use another cantrip, and with Get Probe gone, you can't just draw it for free. So Opt would let you actually draw the card, with the downside of digging, 1 less deep. But I think Opt is good enough that people will try it in all kinds of cases. And whether it replaces Serum Visions or it just goes alongside it. Maybe it replaces something else. like a peak or something. Or maybe you just play 4 Siren Visions, 4 Ops. I don't know, but I think this is good enough for Modern, and I think we'll see it floating around.
I've been slowly warming up to Opt. When I first saw it, I was like, all right, we're Siren Visions, maybe better than like Sleight of Hand and the next best cantrip, so it'll see play. But the more I think about how it will actually play, the more I think it's actually really close to Siren Vision. So one of the big things that got me playing Modern games recently and watching people run out Snapcaster mages as ambush vipers with Siren Visions in their graveyard during my end step, and I'm like, it would be nice if you could have flashed something back there with your Snapcaster, and with Op, since it's an instant speed, you can flash in the Snapcaster end of your opponent's turn and still get your Siren Visions value. So it does actually add a lot of flexibility to your Snapcaster, because there's a lot of awkward times where you kind of like main phase your Snapcaster because you really want to cast your Siren Visions, but you don't feel good about main phasing your Snapcaster because you'd rather leave your mana up. So with Opt, you can kind of have your cake and eat it too with your Snapcaster timings. So I don't know. I think it's close. I still think that Siren Visions might be slightly better, but I agree with you that Opt is definitely going to see some play in Modern, and I wouldn't be surprised if, at least in the near future, we see people trying it out over Siren Visions. I think there will be people who are just like, all right, switch them in for the Siren Visions. Let's see what happens. Let's see how good this really is. So anyway, Richard, that brings us to the end of our top 10 cards from Ixalan for Modern. So do you have any other final thoughts on anything on the way out the door today?
I'm really excited to see what people's opinions are. There was nothing kind of clear cut from our discussion today. A lot of the cards, kind of like Opt, or kind of like a Kopala, it's like, maybe it'll be good, maybe it won't be. We're going to need a lot of play testing to figure it out. And I like it when it's like that. I don't like the fatal push cards where you're like, well, obviously it's like Snap auto included in like half the decks in the format. Here you actually need to think and brew and think about your deck and think about what's going to happen with the meta game. So I really like that, and it'll be an exciting few weeks when Ixalan releases and we see the results of the various tournaments, Modern tournaments, using the Ixalan cards.
Yeah, I think it's really true. If you go back on our list, all the way down to really like the honorable mentions up to some of the very top cards on our list, there's really not much separating them. Like, they're all in the same place where maybe they're going to be good enough to show up in Modern, maybe we find out they're not good enough, but that is really exciting to have this huge list of almost 20 cards that I really think have at least enough potential that they're worth testing in the format, which feels pretty good for a standard legal set when we're talking about Modern. Sometimes we're really just like scraping around the bottom of the barrel, like, oh man, like, sure, maybe there's 1 in a million that someone plays this card, but they probably shouldn't. It doesn't feel like that. A lot of these cards seem like they actually have a bit of potential and are worth testing, so I think it's going to be a super exciting time in Modern with the new Ixalan cards. Anyway, big thanks to everyone for watching. Make sure to let us know what you think. What do you think of Opt? Is it better than Siren Visions? Is Sorcerous Spyglass better than Pithing Needle? The other cards on the list, are there other homes for them or synergies that we didn't think of or talk about? Make sure to let us know. So thanks again for watching. Richard, big thank you to you for hanging out. It's always fun to do these videos.
Yeah, it's always fun talking Modern.
And we will be back, I guess, in a few months to talk about Rivals of Ixalan and the best Modern cards there. So until then, enjoy the new Ixalan cards, and we will talk to you soon. Thanks for watching the video. If you enjoyed it, help us out by clicking that like button down below. And to keep up on all the latest and greatest, click that subscribe button. And don't forget to hit that bell icon to get alerts whenever we have new videos. And if you want to, check out some of our other sweet videos here and here.